What if I told you that the most dangerous cult in America isn't hiding in the woods, it's hiding in plain sight, and most of us were raised in it? What if Christianity isn't just a religion, but the most normalized death cult in America? Think of scriptures such as to live is Christ, to die is gain. Christianity has an obsession with death, not just with what happens after we die, not just with the image of a man tortured on a cross, but with the belief that death is the answer to pain, to injustice, to identity, to meaning. For a lot of us, especially in Black communities, that belief was fed to us as love. It showed up in our funerals, our worship, our prayers, and our parenting. We didn't question it because it was everywhere, because we were taught that suffering was holy and this life wasn't our home. But what if we've been trained to worship suffering, to fear critical thinking, to long for an end instead of building a bridge to better? And what if that obsession with death, not just in fringe cults, but in mainstream Christianity, has quietly prepared generations of people to accept violence as righteousness, authoritarianism as order, and Christian nationalism as a holy mission? I'm not here to attack your grandma's faith. I'm here to name what's hurting us. Because until we confront the death cult at the heart of American Christianity, we will keep feeding generations into systems that rob them of joy, purpose, and power, all in the name of salvation. So let's talk about it plainly, carefully, and without flinching. What exactly is a death cult? So let's ground this conversation. A death cult is usually defined as a group, religious, spiritual, ideological, or even political, that centers its beliefs, rituals, or identity around death, dying, or sacrifice. It's not just that they believe in an afterlife or that they talk about death, it's how they glorify it. They make it sacred. They make it necessary. Sometimes they even make it a requirement. In death cults, suffering becomes salvation. Martyrdom is the goal. And life, this life, it's just something to get through or escape from or sacrifice for something greater. The leaders are often charismatic, demanding absolute loyalty, and they control who lives, who dies, and who's considered pure, authentic, or truly loyal. And most death cults believe the world is ending anyway, so why bother fixing anything? Why build? Why heal? Why protect the planet or democracy or each other for that matter, if destruction is inevitable and holy? When you hear it like that, it's easy to think of the obvious: Jonestown, Heaven's Gates, the Branch Davidians. But I want to challenge you to consider something deeper. What if mainstream American Christianity has been operating under these exact same patterns, just with better branding? So let's look at the characteristics of a death cult and ask ourselves honestly, how many of these match the faith we were taught to defend? There are 7 characteristics of a death cult that I want to point out here and how Christianity mirrors them. There's the glorification of death. In a death cult, death isn't just a fact of life, it's the goal. It's sacred. It's celebrated. It's the ultimate win. Sound familiar? Again, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. Jesus died for you. What are you willing to die for? In Christianity, death isn't just the end of life, it's the gateway to glory. And the message is clear. Earth is corrupt. The body is sinful. The afterlife is everything. That glorification seeps into everything, from funerals that feel like praise parties to songs that beg Jesus to take us home. There's also an obsession with the afterlife or ultimate sacrifice. Death cults often obsess over what happens next, the reward, the paradise, the cosmic payoff, and they elevate sacrifice as the highest form of love. In Christianity, it's almost impossible to separate belief from afterlife obsession. Heaven is the goal, hell is the threat, salvation is the contract that preserves the afterlife experience. And dying for the gospel is the badge of honor. This is why martyrs are canonized, while people who choose life, peace, pleasure, presence are often viewed as weak, worldly, or lost. We're taught to look past life and focus on what comes after, while those lost people continue to press humanity forward. There's also the authoritarian or charismatic leadership. Death cults are usually led by someone who claims exclusive authority or access to truth and demands loyalty. In Christianity, we call them pastors, bishops, apostles, or even prophets. They say things like, "Touch not my anointed," or "Believe in the prophets, so shall you prosper." They say questioning leadership is rebellion. They tell you God speaks to them, and if you don't submit, you're out of alignment, you're out of purpose. And what happens to people who challenge that system? They're silenced, they're shunned, they're shamed, sometimes even called deceived, sometimes even blamed for the judgment that comes on the group. That's not spiritual covering, that's social control. But there's also the apocalyptic worldview. Death cults believe the world is going to end, and not only that, they welcome it. It's not just a prophecy, it's a hope for them, a cleansing fire, a divine reset. Christianity is built around this. We're living in the last days, they say. This world is not our home. Jesus is coming back soon, and this time with a sword. No more water, fire next time. And if the world's going to end anyway, then why care about justice? Why fight for climate solutions, public health, or human rights? That's how you end up with people cheering on destruction because they think it's all a part of God's plan. There's also isolation and indoctrination. In death cults, outsiders are enemies. Doubt is dangerous. Questions are threats. Be not unequally yoked. Avoid worldly wisdom. Lean not on your own understanding, says Scripture. Don't question God's ways, which is not in Scripture, but the people of the book seem to say it a lot. Many Christians are taught to fear outsiders, suppress questions, and rely solely on doctrine. This is why so many people jump into my comments to warn others, don't listen to this man. Even family members are seen as dangerous if they don't believe. This isn't just spiritual protection, it's intellectual isolation. There's also the control over life and death decisions. In some cults, leaders decide who lives, who dies, who gets healed, and who gets shamed. In Christianity, that control often looks like teaching people not to seek therapy. Just pray about it. Demonizing medication, it's just a lack of faith. Shaming suicide victims, but then calling death gain. Telling people of the pride community that they're better off dead than affirmed. Let's not forget how many people have literally died because they followed Christian teachings that have told them to have faith instead of seeking real help. Rejection of the physical world is another major characteristic of death cults. Death cults often teach that the body is evil, the earth is temporary, and the material world is just a trap. Christianity has perfected this narrative. The flesh is weak. This life is but a vapor. Deny yourself. Crucify your flesh. Store up treasures in heaven. Don't love the world or the things in it. And this one kind of gets me. And so I have to take a sidestep and go off script a little bit here. Of course, you cannot take it with you. Do not love the things of this world because you can't store them up in heaven. But what about the children that you brought in this world that you did not leave an inheritance for? That is the problem with that type of thinking. And that is how you produce generational poverty over and over again, by having people who consume everything they have with the understanding that I can't take it with me anyway. And who cares about those kids that I brought into this world? Back to regularly scheduled programming. So people are taught to detach from their bodies, ignore their needs, and endure suffering as proof of faith. The result? Generations of people who've never been taught how to enjoy life because they were raised to believe that joy, rest, and embodiment were distractions. When you lay it all out like that, it's hard to deny. Christianity, as many of us know it, checks every box of a death cult. And not just on the fringe, not just in some backwoods compound, but right there in your neighborhood church, right there in your children's Bible. So the question is, what has that done to us? Now I want to talk about how death cult doctrine reshaped our minds and our lives. Because let's be clear, this isn't just about theology, it's about the psychological and sociological damage that happens when a death cult belief system is normalized over generations, especially in Black communities where the church isn't just a spiritual hub, but is often seen as the cultural center, the authority, the tradition, the inheritance even. So when Christianity teaches us that life is temporary, that pain is divine, that joy is suspicious, that affects how we think, how we live, and what we believe we deserve. Here's what happens when you're exposed to that kind of doctrines for years or even decades. It dulls or disables critical thinking functionality through fear, control, and guilt. It devalues the ability to enjoy life. Joy becomes suspicious or sinful. Personal purpose is suppressed or externally defined. Emotional health is damaged by fear, shame, and emotional numbing. Connection to others is undermined by isolation and detachment. And your sense of self, is often shattered or never allowed to form in the first place. This is why so many Christian women experience the sense of losing themselves in relationships. The truth is, they never actually formed their sense of self. And here's the thing, many of us have never known life outside of that framework. We were born into it, raised to believe that our suffering made us holy and our joy made us selfish. We were told that pleasure is dangerous, questioning is rebellion, and self-love is pride. We grew up learning how to pray, but never how to feel safe in our own bodies. We were trained to surrender, to obey, to endure, but never to think, choose, or heal. This is not just religious trauma, it's cultural conditioning, passed down like scripture, enforced like law, and normalized like tradition. And when we zoom out, we can start to see what this has done, not just to individuals, but to entire communities. And there has been a long-term cost in the Black community. This is where it gets personal, because it's one thing to talk about death cults in theory. It's another to look at what these beliefs have done to Black people for generations in a country already built on our exploitation. Christianity was not just handed to us, it was enforced, weaponized, first through the Bible in one hand, chains in the others, and later through songs, sermons, and Sunday schools that sanctified suffering and trained us to find peace in pain. Let's break down how this death-centered doctrine has played out in real life, especially across Black American communities. Critical thinking is often discouraged. Questioning doctrine equals rebellion against God. We were taught to fear knowledge, especially if it challenged the Bible, and that fear kills our curiosity before it can even bloom. Skepticism, that's a demon. Philosophy, that's worldly. Science, be careful, or you will lose your religion. The impact of this is that generations of brilliant minds were trained to defend myths instead of dismantling systems. We taught apologetics before we ever learned actual history. And this is how you get into the glorification of suffering. In so many Black churches, suffering is spiritualized. Poverty, that's a test. Trauma, that's your cross to bear. Depression, baby, just pray harder. We've been taught to romanticize the grind, spiritualize the pain, and call it faith. This becomes a cultural script. Healing feels like rebellion, therapy feels like weakness, and joy feels like disobedience. This leads to deferred liberation. Heaven becomes the answer to injustice, not reparations, not revolution, just endurance. We were told freedom would come later, in the sweet by and by. So instead of building systems that liberate us, we've spent generations building choirs and waiting rooms. Generations delay or abandon the fight for tangible material liberation because they've been trained to wait. Revolution gets replaced with revival. This also has an impact on identity formation. When you're told you were born in sin, that your flesh is wicked, and that your body is a battleground, how do you even learn to love yourself? Especially in a racist society that already tells you you're worthless. Now your religion says it too? Our children grow up never knowing what it means to feel whole. They don't know their worth unless it's filtered through obedience, shame, sacrifice, or somebody else's salvation. These aren't just theological side effects, these are cultural consequences. They shape how we live, how we dream, how we organize, and what we believe is even possible. And the truth is, we've seen this pattern before. When people internalize a theology of death, it doesn't just stay in their minds or their pews or their pulpits. Eventually, it becomes the politics of the day. By now, it should be clear. Christianity, as many of us inherited it, doesn't just center death. It glorifies suffering, demands submission, suppresses thoughts, and waits for the world to end. But when that kind of belief system gains political power, it doesn't just stay in the church, it becomes law, it becomes policy, it becomes violence in God's name. That's how Christian nationalism was born, not as a corruption of Christianity, but as its natural evolution in a society built on racial hierarchy, patriarchy, and religious domination. Let's break down exactly how death cult doctrine laid the groundwork for the rise of nationalism. Death cult doctrine creates a martyr mindset. Take up your cross, be willing to die for the gospel. Persecution is proof that you're righteous. Those aren't just metaphors, they're dog whistles that create a worldview where opposition equals validation. So when people push back on harmful ideas like banning books, erasing queer people, or forcing childbirth, Christian nationalists don't see that as accountability. They see it as proof that they're chosen. This is how they frame dominance as defense. Every resistance is persecution. Every pushback is spiritual war, and that war justifies real violence. Anti-life theology makes authoritarianism seems righteous. Mainstream Christianity teaches that humans are depraved, the world is evil, and only God and his appointed can rule justly. So the idea of a democracy or consent or even nuance, that's seen as soft, corrupt, or chaotic. Christian nationalists don't want freedom. They want control. They want order. And that order comes from God's law, not the people. That's how you end up with people calling dictators anointed. That's how you excuse cruelty as divine discipline. And that's how a country can start to look like a theocracy in a business suit. End times thinking justifies destruction. They say things like Jesus is coming back any day now. The world is going to burn. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. These beliefs create a fatalistic mindset where the world is supposed to fall apart and there's no need to stop it. Climate change, part of prophecy. Civil war, God's purging the wicked. Voting rights, God's judgment on a rebellious nation. Christian nationalism thrives in this mindset because it gives people permission to abandon justice, ignore suffering, and embrace collapse. Furthermore, the glorification of the cross makes sacrifice seem noble, even when it's violent. Christianity teaches that God demanded blood, that suffering redeems, that pain is holy if it's for the right cause. That belief trains people to see violence as sacred if it's done in the name of purity, order, or truth. This is how laws that harm real people, queer folk, black folk, women folk, immigrants, non-believers, this is how they get framed as love. The cross stops being a symbol of compassion and becomes a badge of moral superiority. And then you get to this place where loyalty to doctrine is considered greater than empathy for people, where you say things like God is love, but he'll send your ass to hell. Loving someone means correcting their sin. Truth matters more than your feelings. Christianity often teaches ideological loyalty over human flourishing. That's how Christian nationalists can deny trans people care, take away bodily autonomy, erase entire identities, and still feel like they're loving people. Because in their minds, loyalty to doctrine is compassion, and empathy becomes a threat. These words have literally been said. So they begin using language such as we're under attack for our faith. We need God's law to control people. We're justified in destroying systems. They're doomed. Cleansing the nation is holy work. God's truth matters more than your feelings or your rights. After all of the monstrosities committed by Christianity, how do we not realize that biblical doctrine is literally the makings of a monster 101? So no, Christian nationalism isn't some new extremist movement. It's the logical outcome of centuries of death-obsessed theology, authoritarian teaching, and apocalyptic indoctrination. It's not a political hijacking. It's the social consequence of tolerating death doctrines. So I want to ask this question: what could be gained if we let go? If everything I've said so far feels heavy, it's because it is. We've inherited a theology that taught us to romanticize pain, worship obedience, fear our own questions, and wait for heaven while the world falls apart. But what if we let that go? What if we stopped calling death a reward, stopped calling silence obedience, stopped calling trauma God's will, and just started living? Imagine if all of the energy we've spent waiting for Jesus, glorifying suffering, and defending the Bible was rerouted into something that actually helped people heal. What could we build instead? Perhaps cooperative businesses that prioritize people over politics. Maybe community-based education that values curiosity over conformity. Or maybe even ethical frameworks rooted in compassion, not commandments. Maybe joy-centered spaces that celebrate life, art, and rest. Therapy and body work that helps us process generations of grief. And maybe we get to the place where we elevate critical thinkers over charismatic performers. Maybe we get to a place where our children are safe to ask real questions, even ones that seem dangerous. We don't even know what our communities are capable of because so much of our collective imagination has been outsourced to the sky. But the truth is, we are here, we exist, we matter, and we don't need a death cult to tell us that. We need a new imagination, one that honors this life, one that celebrates this body, one that sees joy, justice, and curiosity as sacred. It's not enough to leave the church. We have to leave the theology that told us we weren't worthy of life by design. So let's stop pretending this is just about faith. Let's stop pretending this is just about heaven. Let's stop pretending that this is just about church. This is about a belief system that taught people to glorify death, fear freedom, and submit to power, all in the name of God. It's about a doctrine that told enslaved people to wait for heaven and told their descendants that suffering makes them holy, while building entire systems that depend on them never getting up. It's about how the same theology that taught us to love the cross now justifies the flag, and how a death-obsessed religion has become the emotional engine of American domination. That's why this matters, because Christian nationalism didn't hijack Christianity. It's the inevitable outcome of death cult doctrine played out in politics, policies, and pulpits. And the only way to stop it is to confront the theology that gave it permission. So if you grew up in this system, you're not crazy for feeling like something was off. You're not wrong for questioning it. You're not bitter. You're not even broken. You're finally seeing it for what it is. The church taught us how to die. Now we get to learn how to live. Not in fear, not in guilt, not in silence, but in truth. With our minds intact, our bodies whole, and our futures back in our hands. I hope you've gotten some value from this conversation today. Until next time, keep rising.